Good evening, viewers. First of all, let me thank Shyamala and Kahani Tagbak for giving me this chance of sharing some of my experiences as a writer. This evening, I'm planning to speak about my journey as a writer and how it has been a process of learning all the way. First things first, people often ask me, how did I begin? Did I always want to be a children's writer? Now, the answer is quite simple. I had always wanted to be a writer, but my becoming a children's writer was a total accident. It happened this way. It was soon after I had done my master's in English and I was visiting Delhi when after seeing various tourist spots, I went to see the dolls museum. I was looking at all the dolls, the brides and all that, and I made some remark. Somebody heard me, and after a while the same lady came and said, Mr. Shankar wants you inside. Mr. Shankar was the owner of the dolls museum, and I wondered what he could possibly want with me. So when I went in, he asked me, I heard you said that one of the brides, the Bengali bride, is not right, some mistake. Why? I said that, you see, sir, the Bengali bride is wearing a black blouse. This is something no Bengali bride would be allowed to do because black is considered an inauspicious color. At least it was like that in those days. Even if the bride made her hair, she had to make it with red ribbons, however bad it looked. So we got talking and he asked me what I did and all that. And then he spoke to me about Children's Book Trust and took me to see it and said that you said you are interested in writing, but tell me, have you ever thought of writing for children? I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, why don't you give it a thought? Because you see, I feel that the children today are forgetting their heritage. They are forgetting that India has such a large cultural background, the epics, the classics, the mythology. And I have, I wish to give it back to them by telling these stories in English so that they can know about it. Now, I'm looking for someone to write the story of Harishchandra and Shakuntala. Will you try? I said, yes, I don't mind at all. But I'm going back in a couple of days' time. He said, all right, you go back, you write it, send me your first draft, let me see how you're getting on. And that was that. I went back and I was very happy that it was Harishchandra and Shakuntala because Rama and Mahabharat and the epics and Puranas, they've always been very special to me. I was more or less brought up on them, so I didn't have to do much reading because I knew the stories already, but I read them up and started writing. And then I sent him my first drafts. He said, yes, it's working out quite well, but of course it will need a lot of work because you are new to book writing, you have never done it before, but never mind. When you send it when it is complete and you get on with the other book. So I sent him Harishchandra and it was published in the year 1971. I was the joint author because Mr. Shankar had to put in a lot of work. Then I went on with Shakuntala and that was published in the year 1973. That also I had a joint authorship. By then I was already in Delhi and I wanted to do a book on my own, totally on my own. So I went and asked Mr. Shankar that please could I do the story of Sharmishta? It is a story that has fascinated me always. He said, all right, try it. I wrote Sharmishta and there were a lot of corrections and, you know, rewritings, which was inevitable as it was my first independent book. But the book was published in the year 1976 and I was really very happy. The next instance was that by then Mr. Shankar had already started a magazine for children called Children's World. It was the only children's magazine at the time and it enjoyed a very wide circulation going to all parts of the country. Mr. K. Ramakrishnan was the editor. So Mr. Shankar introduced me to him and Mr. Ramakrishnan said, "Why don't you write for the magazine?" I said, "What would you like me to write?" He said that, "Well, you have been writing a lot of classics for Mr. Shankar, so why don't you go on, because I would also like it. So you can give us stories from the Mahabharata." So it was really quite nice and enjoyable and I started writing them. So I gave him a series of stories from Mahabharata, from the Puranas, from Katha Sarit Sagar, Vikraman Betal, from Vikramaditya's throne, and so on and so forth. They were all classics and mythology. While I was writing these stories and gathering experience as a writer, I learned two very important lessons from Mr. Ramakrishnan. I found that when my stories were being published, they were very much shorter than the ones I had presented. A lot had been cut out. So I went to him one day and said that, "Mr. Ramakrishnan, see, you have been cutting out so much from my stories. I mean, they are very, very, almost half of what I have written." He said, "Yes, I've had to do it because you see, we have to carry a story with a certain number of words. I have to put in pictures and everything. And if you exceed that word limit, I have to cut it. I don't have any choice." So I said, "But the themes are so long. How do I make them shorter?" Then he said, "Why? Haven't you done pressy writing in school? Condense them. Make them as brief as you can. Tell the story without sort of omitting anything important, but try to tell it in a very condensed manner. Secondly, don't write anything which is not directly related to the stories. You must learn how to cut out. I know it is very difficult, but then you are beginning to write, you start beginning to be a writer. This is something every writer has to learn. You must learn to write a story within its word limit." Now, those were the days when there were no computers. Very few had typewriters. So mostly, I think 98% of the authors, we gave handwritten submissions. And I'm sure you can't even imagine now how very boring it is to count words in a handwritten manuscript. It was terrible. Anyway, I tried to make my stories shorter and shorter. And then Mr. Ramakrishnan told me another thing, that there's another thing you need to learn. That is to make your language simpler. I know you're fresh from the university, you enjoy using big, high-sounding, nice-sounding words. But see, don't forget, you're writing for children. While these words may be okay in a research paper, they are not really suitable for children. So, don't write long sentences. Cut them out, cut them short. And whenever you feel tempted to use big words, well, curb your temptation. Replace it with a simpler word. This is the best way to reach out to children. Be as direct as you can. So this was the second and very important lesson that I learned at that stage. The next editor whom I confronted was Mr. Anant Pai of Amar Chitrakatha. He was also very encouraging and he told me that right now I'm making a collection of folk tales from all over India. So why don't you give me some folk tales from Bengal? I said, "Fine, I haven't read many, but I'll do it and I'll send it." So I wrote some folk tales for him. One was The Rainbow Prince, The other was a collection called Sukhu and Dukhu. I think they are both still available with Amar Chitrakatha. And after that, I felt, not after that, I'd been feeling for quite some time that I was not satisfied. It was fun to write these stories. I was getting practice. I was able to write it within 1,000 words or 800 words, just as required. I was well accustomed to that drill. But all said and done, I was retelling somebody else's story. Not These were not my own, and I wanted to write original stories. So I went and spoke to the editor again and said, I want to write some original stories. He said, okay, go ahead. He was very, very encouraging. He never said no to anything. He said, yes, you try it out. If it is good enough, we will carry it. So that is when I started writing the Teddy stories. The stories are about two sisters who live with their grandparents and the Alsatian dog Teddy and the many adventures that happened to them. I loved writing these stories because they were based on real life experience. My sister and I had spent our entire school life staying with our grandparents and his dog Leo. So these stories reflected more or less what we had experienced with him. Of course, a lot of things were imaginary also, but they were with these three central characters. After that, I thought I would write a school story. Again, I went and discussed it with the editor, and he said he was a bit skeptical. He said, now, why would anybody want to read a school story written by you in English when there are so many school stories available all round? Stories of Enid Blyton, stories of Elsie Jean Oxenham, stories by so many others. So why? I said because I'm planning to base this story on an Indian school with Indian characters. So I think the children might be interested. He said, okay, try it out. But I'm warning you, if the children don't seem to like it or if it doesn't work out, I'm going to pull it out midways. So you must be mentally prepared for that. I said, yes, I don't mind taking the risk. So I started writing the Junelli stories. The first book was Junelli's first term. I set it, the backdrop was my very own school, Carmel Convent in Hazaribagh. Many of the characters, both of teachers and students, were real. Many of the incidents were real. And the background and setting, everything. I made it as realistic as I could. And it was very, very popular. The children took to it at once. And I was asked to write it. It was serialized in Children's World for over a year. And after it was complete, the children wanted a sequel. In those days, the children did not write to the authors directly, they wrote to the editor. So Mr. Ramakrishnan would preserve all those letters, and he showed me, said, the children are very serious, they want a sequel, so can you write one? I said, yes. So I wrote 2 more sequels, and all of them were serialized in Children's World. Now, there are a lot of people who still remember the Junelli stories. I always coming across people who are, well settled now, professors, teachers, reporters, journalists, and they keep telling me that, we grew up reading the Junelli and the Teddy stories. I've often wondered, why is it that the Junelli stories became so popular? I can think of 3 very good reasons. It is not that I wrote anything very wonderful or out of the way or something unique, not at all. It was because, number 1, it was the first English story of an Indian school with Indian characters, where the children felt they were able to connect and identify not only with the characters but with the situations. And the second reason was it reached so many children because Children's World had such a wide and vast circulation. So the story reached people. Much later, I was told by people in Ajmer or Kanpur or Trishur that they had loved these stories and read them as children. So, since it was the only children's magazine, most schools also subscribed to it. So, lot of children got to read them. That was another reason. And thirdly, it was because my own school, Carmel, had also a huge network of schools. There are Carmel convents all over India. They may not be called Carmel, they have different names such as St. Joseph's or uh, Sacred Hearts or Fatima Convent or Nirmala Convent. The name might be different, but the organization is the same and the pattern is absolutely the same. So, what happened was, no matter where the school is set, they could locate or rather find things which were common to their school, such as everywhere the school office being called the parlor, all Carmel convents. Then the reference to the boarders' feast, Mother General's visit, guides, campfires, songs being sung in rounds, and songs such as Woomba, 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 inevitably sung at all campfires, and welcoming a bishop by singing Vivat, Vivat Pastor Bonus. So, Carmelites all over India recognized the pattern instantly, and they were the ones who liked my story most of all. And because they were in such a huge number, I think that is how it grew to be so popular. Years later, in those days, Children's Book Trust had a very strong principle, as I'm sure it's followed even now, that they do not publish as books anything which is which has been published before, either in Children's World or anywhere else. Years later, when Indus Books opened in India, which was an imprint of HarperCollins, they wanted stories, and they liked my and I took permission. I was given the permission by Mr. Ravi Shankar, who was the chairman at the time, to submit it to them, and they liked the stories, and they brought them out in 1992. But later, they sold very well for some time, but later they went out of circulation, or rather, they went out of print when Indus closed shop. Fairly recently, just some years ago, two young publishers from Goa, Leonard and Queenie Fernandez, brought out my three Junali books as e-books, which I hope are still available. So while all this was happening in one front, on the other front, Mr. Shankar started the Association of Writers and Illustrators for Children, known as AWIC, with Mrs. Manorama Jaffa at the helm. And all of us who were young and struggling writers, all of us were very enthusiastic members. Now, AWIC has also been another great learning process for me. Because apart from bringing out the journal regularly, where the journal carried very informative articles by well-known writers, which were very, very helpful to us. Also, there were competitions where we were asked to write various kinds of stories. Stories on ecology or on nature or history or an adventure or a fantasy, whatever. All different kinds of genres, but we wrote the stories for the competition. And later, As we read each other's stories and discovered the strong points, that was also a very big learning point. And apart from all that, and gradually as we gathered more experience, we started, the members of our week started getting assignments from Children's Book Trust. For example, they were bringing out a series called Our Leaders, and we got the assignment of writing the biography of some famous Indian. We had assignments from Ratnasagar also, so it was quite an exciting time for us. But it was also a time, for me at least, for self analysis. I think every reader, every writer should know or ought to know what are her strengths and weaknesses. What are the things she can write with conviction and what are the things she can't? This is something I realized at that stage. Although I loved by then, lot of us were already published authors, and although I loved Arup Datta's Kaziranga Trail and Nilima Sinha's Chandipur Jewels, I loved them. They're beautiful stories. But I also knew that it was not my cup of tea. I knew that this is something I could not write comfortably. Also, fantasy was another genre where I was not at all comfortable. While writing the biography, which had been our assignment, I got to know that although I would enjoy very much writing about a person, writing stories based on some incidents of his life, writing a total life history of somebody was really not my cup of tea. I got very bored. I didn't want to be so involved with one character for such a long time. And because it needs very intensive study to be able to write a good biography. So these are the three genres: adventure, mystery, fantasy, and biography, which I did not attempt later. When I was in a position to pick and choose, I tried to steer clear of them because I knew it's not that I could not dream up a situation or a mystery, but I knew I could never write with conviction. Then, what was it that I enjoyed writing? Also, another very important thing, I knew, at least for myself, so long as I was very happy writing a story, I could never be convincing. So, it was very, very important writing about something which I knew, which was familiar to me, and which gave me joy at the time of writing. Because if I wrote something and felt that it was something like a kind of a homework which had to be got rid of at all costs, had to be done anyhow, somehow, well then, that story would turn out to be very boring for the readers. So, more or less later on, when I did write original stories, I stuck to real life incidents, what I was familiar with, characters I was familiar with, and situations which I was familiar with. I found that easiest to write. And I think even now, if I'm remembered as the writer of Junelli's stories, or the Teddy stories, or the Tinku stories, which I wrote later for Telegraph. So, this was the first phase of learning during my journey as an author.